What if you have a system, an institution, a way of thinking, all in a particular culture that has grown hidebound and just simply wrong? Can art, and poetry more specifically, help set it right, help nudge it along even a little, even a little? Well, that's the kind of question we love to ask here on Poetry, Passion, and Pleasure podcast with your host, Dale Byron. That's me. This is the place where head and heart, where the emotional, our emotional life, our strategic, intellectual life are both welcome to come together in a more powerful synergy is our hope. So, the title of today's podcast, this edition, is called Art as a Sacred Subversion, or even as a sacred nudge toward a more skillful way. Now, just to jump right into it, I was thinking that the word subversion, actually, it's Latin. It means to overthrow. It's to undermine. It's an undermining of the power and authority of an established system or tradition. And I don't know about you, but it occurs to me that the state of our ecological predicaments, the state of some of our political challenges that we are facing, that we need some transitional kinds of subversion. We need some transitional changes. And what I want to do today is I want to experiment. I want to explore the possibility of art and poetry in particular as a way to peacefully and skillfully subvert the existing ways of thinking in the existing system. And I have a great poem for us to start out with by the amazing poet Jane Hirschfield, and it's called On the Fifth Day. Let's just jump right in, okay? It goes like this. On the fifth day. On the fifth day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or study the rivers. Get the scene here? On the fifth day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air, and the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers of boulders and air, bound to gravity, earless and tongueless. The untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the fifth day of silence. They spoke the fifth day of silence. Now, to me, this delightful, delicious Jane Hirschfield poem called On the Fifth Day, to me, this poem is its matter-of-fact ways, its beautiful, understated lines, is a devastating answer to the authoritarian ways that it is addressing. I think it is a skillful way for us to begin to step into territory that if we were simply loud and shrill would close people down instead of open people up. And I just love the way, she says, the silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. So no matter if you have the authoritarian control, that tells the scientists who study the rivers they can no longer speak or study the rivers. You tell the scientists who study the air they cannot study or speak of the air. But then you come with this story, this poem. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. But then what happens? Now, only the rivers that spoke of the rivers. But now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, but still something was speaking. And the bees were speaking of the wind, or the wind that spoke of the bees, rather, while the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. So we get this kind of subversive kind of thing that's happening. You can't keep that silence. Even the silence talks about silence and pushes up against that admonition. They spoke the fifth day of silence. Powerful poem. Powerful, powerful poem for me. So subversion, the undermining of power and the authority of an established system or institution. And it seems to me that only when our hearts are open are we then able to change our mind. It is a heart that's open which happens first before a mind changes. And that's really, I think, one of the powerful things about art in general, and for me, poetry in particular. So let's just keep moving along with some delicious, subversive poetry. Remember what our theme is. If art is going to save the world, and if poetry in particular can, how will it do that? We're exploring the mechanics of that. Okay, this is a poem by William Stafford. I've loved this poem for a long time. It's called "The Star in the Hills." Okay, let's see what William Stafford had to say about the star in the hills. It goes like this. A star hit in the hills behind our house. A star hit in the hills behind our house, up where the grass turns brown, touching the sky. Meteors have hit the world before, but this was near. And since TV, few saw, but many felt the shock. The state of California owns that land, and out from shore 3 miles, and any stars that come will be roped off and viewed on weekdays 8 to 5. 8 to 5. A guard who took the oath of loyalty and denied any police record told me this: if you don't have a police record yet, you could take the oath and get a job if California should be hit by another star. I'd promise to be loyal to California and to guard any stars that hit it, I said, or any place 3 miles out from shore, unless the star was bigger than the state, in which case I'd be loyal to it. But he said no exceptions were allowed. And he leaned against the state-owned meteor, so calm, and puffed a cork-tipped cigarette, that I looked down and traced with my foot in the dust and thought again and said, okay, any star. Delicious, subversive humor, as though someone could control a meteor, as though someone could be in full charge of what's happening. This reminds me of so many of our ecological conundrums and predicaments and challenges, that they're so complex, and that we imagine that the technology, or much of the technology, its unintended consequences, that somehow or another we're going to solve those unintended consequences with more technology. I'm not saying that technology is not going to be important. I'm just saying that technology has been part of the problem, and we have to look at how we use technology going forward. We've got to look at that in a much more holistic way, and at the entire context. So I just love, so the voice in the poem. I'd promise to be loyal to California and to guard any stars that hit it. I said, or any place 3 miles out from shore, unless the star was bigger than the state, in which case I'd be loyal to it. Now, look at that subversiveness. Now, if you came at something head on, oftentimes particularly a very powerful institution, or a powerful narrative that is large in the culture, you are not going to be able to come at that full force. I mean, head on. That this kind of art, this kind of subversive use of humor is often going to be a more skillful way. And then the guard says, but he said no exceptions were allowed, and he leaned against the state-owned meteor, so calm, and puffed a cork-tipped cigarette that I looked down and traced with my foot in the dust, and thought again and said, okay, any star. Well, that even shows us, you can get someone to submit, right? But you can, at least what I read in this poem is he's saying, okay, but I think it's still subversive, and yeah, it's just so delicious. So the note I made for myself about this, I said, never take on the power of a large system directly. First of all, it's dangerous. Have you noticed? Second, it rarely works. It pairs your weakness with the system's strength. When a set of ideas has grown rigid and brittle, and is no longer mapped onto reality, and we have many of those kinds of institutions and narratives and stories that have to be subverted if we are going to move forward in a way. I mean, just the idea that you can have unlimited growth on a finite planet. Has that idea, has it outgrown its usefulness? I think it has. But I say never take on the power of a large system directly, and think of an institution, or think of a narrative that is deep in a culture. Never take on the power of a large system directly. First of all, it's dangerous. You can get hurt. Second, it rarely works. It pairs your weakness. In other words, the small, tiny movement that's trying to shift things, transform things, is so tiny, and it pushes right up against this massive force. So it pairs your weakness with the system's strength. Try this instead. Try this. Use fresh perspectives. Use listening and unexpected similarities. Deep insight. Use surprise, humor, creativity. So, yeah, another note I made is smile, yes, but in that smile, no. Smile, yes, but in that smile, no. Okay, so here is a very brief poem and I've got a number of poems for us this week. It's called The Good Life by Tracy Smith. Let me just read it for you. It's very short. When some people talk about money, they speak as if it were a mysterious lover who went out to buy milk and never came back. And it makes me nostalgic for the years I lived on coffee and bread, hungry all the time, walking to work on payday like a woman journeying for water from a village without a well, then living 1 or 2 nights like everyone else on roast chicken and red wine. For years, I lived on coffee and bread, hungry all the time, walking to work on payday like a woman journeying for water from a village without a well, then living 1 or 2 nights like everyone else on roast chicken and red wine. I love this poem. Again, I think it's highly subversive. The reason, obviously, I picked it, because the note I made for myself is that wealth inequality is rampant in the West, in the USA particularly. Wealth inequality is rampant. Our system is obviously corrupt because it is shoveling all the money to the top. It's fixed. It's corrupt. Many of us realize that. Now, we could rail on about this, or we could slip in a little poem. We could get our poems kind of hidden and slipped in. We can do that. Let it slide, I said, under the radar screen of the strategic mind, straight into the feeling heart where true motivation lies. Remember, we talked about the idea that an open heart precedes a changing mind. An open heart precedes a changing mind. And as I was thinking about that, I said, what opens a heart? Well, loss, hurt, beauty, kindness, deep understanding, gratitude, being listened to more fully, feeling safe. All those things open our hearts and get us ready for the mind to be opened, and so that change can happen. Now, conversely, what causes a heart? I was brainstorming about this. What closes a heart? Fear, violence, trauma, hatred, anger, loss, being ignored, feeling endangered. All those things close the heart down. So what we're doing with art is we're working to open up the heart. We're using all sorts of images and methods, particularly with poetry, the art of poetry. We're looking to open the heart so that there's a chance, so that the strategic mind has its own, radar sensing device. But if we can get up under that and directly to the heart, then we have a chance to make some transformational change, which I think is what we need. So, advice from Rock Creek Park. This is the next poem I want to bring by Stephanie Burt. Amazing poet. Advice from Rock Creek Park. Poem goes like this. What will survive us? What will survive us has already begun. Oak galls, 2 termites curious, self-perpetuating bodies, letting the light through the gaps. They lay out their allegiances under the roots of an overturned tree, almost always better to build them. Almost always better to build than to wreck. You can build in a wreck. Under the roots of an overturned tree, consider the martin, the bird, the martin that hefts herself over traffic cones. Consider her shadow misaligned over parking lot cement. Saran wrap scrape in her beak. Nothing lasts. Nothing lasts forever, not even the future we want. Nothing lasts. Nothing lasts forever, not even the future we want. The president has never owned the reign. Nothing lasts forever, not even the future. The president has never owned the reign. You know, you could go straight at something. You could yell and raise your voice and show anger and do all those things. And I'm not saying that, sometimes there's a place for that. But anything that closes the heart down, in my humble opinion, is going to be not so good at changing minds. And one of the things that this shows us, rather than admonishing people for not being more humble, or our narrative for not being more humble, I love the way this poem just kind of sneaks up on us. It says, nothing lasts forever, not even the future we want. And then here's the line: the president has never owned the reign. We are going to have to get way more humble as a species, I believe. I truly believe, if we are going to meet the challenges, ecological challenges in particular, of Earth overshoot, and all climate being one of those, as I've said on this podcast before. There's many other overshoot challenges that are coming at us like speeding freight trains. Have you noticed? And so we're going to have to get very humble to be able to kind of get over ourselves in a way, so that we can actually listen and look and be aware of what needs transforming, what needs changing, both inside us in terms of our narratives and our stories, and our actions, of course. Now, finally, in this subject of subversion, sometimes we may find that we want to subvert ourselves, that our normal way of thinking, because we have been pickled by this same culture. And then we have to have a lot of empathy for ourselves. It's not to make us wrong or bad or horrible. It's just that the story we're living, particularly around the ecological realities that we're facing, is no longer functional. It's no longer working. In fact, it's working in such a negative way that we are looking at the flute end of some really difficult consequences. But at the same time, we can, as we're trying to look at the systems that we want to begin to tease up to, we want to use art, we want to begin to save the world, to use that grandiose term, at least nudge the world along with art, with poetry. And so sometimes what we need to do is we need to, as the saying goes, arrange for our own disappearance. We need to be able to have a fresh look at ourselves. And here's a poem called Frequency Check, which will, I think, help us have a fresh look at ourselves, at least stop and look differently. So the poem goes like this. This is the last poem we're going to do. Frequency check. Look around, scan for what matters, what brings you alive, even in small ways. Vibrate happiness, vibrate happiness. Never ask what you feel like doing. After all, even hard steps prepare you for the next. When your music slows or stops, look up, look up. Some stars will look back with a kind of white, warm light. These are the ones to follow. Their gaze has already happened, or not, depending upon which way you tilt your head, or even how you hum that one frequency that is always only you. Some stars will look back with a kind of white, warm light. These are the ones to follow. Their gaze has already happened or not, depending upon which way you tilt your head or even how you hum. That one frequency that is always only you. See, when we're out in the world, and we have to remember, I think, to remember that when we change ourselves, the world can't help but change. So sometimes, to use that word subversion, we want to kindly and in a sacred way, a sacred subversion of ourselves as well, so that we can continually show up as centered and as harmonious and as helpful and skillful as we can. And then all these other systems and institutions will have a much better chance of our having something helpful in terms of their transition, our being part of that transition. Sometimes I've thought of this old saying, I've known you so long, I have no idea who you are. I've known you so long, I have no idea who you are. And I think, of course, that can be another person that we've begun to take for granted in our lives. And we have an old map, an old image for them that we are mistaking for who they are this minute today. But we can also do that to ourselves. We can do that to ourselves. So this poem, Frequency Check, I should have mentioned it's a poem that I wrote back in 2018. So it was a poem I was musing about, how can we find that one frequency that is always only us, you. Yeah. So can art change the world? Can art, can it be a sacred subversion of things that we know must evolve and change and shift, including moment by moment ourselves? Well, you be the judge. I think that it's worth considering. Okay. That's a wrap. That's a wrap. Thank you so much for your listening here. I appreciate it. And again, as always, if you know somebody that you think might appreciate this conversation, these poems, please send it along to them. And in the meantime, and until next time, take good care of yourself until we come together again. And as I like to say sometimes, if you can, please take care of someone else as well.